All right, welcome. We're going to go over in this making and texturing the ever-present crate object that you'll find in many games. And it'll go over the basics of both Maya and Photoshop. But in this video, we're just going to start with the intro to Photoshop. And anyways, all right, texture mapping and modeling a simple cube. And when you're texture mapping in for games, the texture map has a huge impact in it. It can change everything. You can have just a simple cube and you can have a fantastic texture on it you could have alpha channels and um, you can have specularity, you can have normal maps. It can really change a whole object. You don't have to have amazing tessellation on the object. If you have the right texture maps, it will help a lot, and your programmers will help you because it's less pressure on the engine, and you can use it to do something else with the engine. So Photoshop is a great tool to really get quite proficient at. And texture maps generally are in multiples of 64, 128, 256, 512. I don't see too many 384s. 768, 1024, 2048. And generally, it's good to create a texture that is larger than the one that you're going to make and then scale it down. But that doesn't mean make a texture for a crate at 2048 and when the texture is only going to be probably like 128. And you don't always have to make them square, but it's still good to have the horizontal and vertical be still multiples of 64. So to start with, we're going to New, and we're going to create a 512 by 512 image. So we have our basic image here. And now all of our tools, of course, are over here on the left. Your marquee tool, we're going to go over key commands. It's vital to know key commands. It's vital to make sure your puppies don't bark while you're trying to record. And then also brushes and cloning and the lasso tool. These guys up here, you'll notice if you hold down on them, you get different tools in them. You can, if you hold shift down and M, you can cycle through them, but generally we're only going to use the rectangular and sometimes the elliptical. The lasso tool, this lasso tool is not quite as useful. The polygonal lasso tool is exceptionally helpful. All right, so let's start. Now, when you're first searching for a texture, we're going to make this crate. It's going to have wooden backing. It's going to have a little frame around it. It's going to have a diagonal line, diagonal board that goes through it. And getting a good idea about how to use layers is also very important. You don't want to keep everything on a single layer because if you want to change it, you're going to run into problems. You have to redo the whole thing. So I'm going to show you how to do some cool stuff with layers and grouping. Your highlight and your shadows, those are on two separate layers. Very handy to keep them on two. Took me a while to learn that lesson. So when we search for something, often we search, Google is great for finding bases for textures. The typical 3D artist will have a library of textures. A lot of times companies will have libraries already, or they'll purchase libraries for you. Depends on what kind of game you're doing. If you're doing a cartoony game, you'll have cartoony illustrated textures. If you're doing a realistic game, there's all different styles. And while you may have your own style, you're always going to have to conform to the style that is most prevalent in the game. That's one of your responsibilities. All right, so let's just look for wood texture. And in this example, we're just going to choose a really simple wood texture. Um, get something with a little bit more of kind of a larger texture, so you have something to work with. I'm going to avoid like smaller textures like that. And this one has a watermark, so we're not going to choose that one. Probably a good one would be either this one, although that looks a little smaller, and it's already 512. And this one's pretty big. So for this example, that one actually looks a lot better. We're going to choose that. Now we could copy this image. Sometimes Photoshop doesn't like to copy stuff um, out of Google, and just paste it right in. Now you'll notice it pasted right in. Some of them might be bigger, smaller, and you can see that there is a little bit on the outside there, so we can scale that down. One of the most important tools in doing Photoshop textures is transforming. And transforming, I don't know where it is up here because I memorized the key command, is Control T, and that will get it up here. We can put that in there. Might be a little squished if we do that. And what I just did there was I double clicked in order to accept it. So if I press Control T and I move it around and I want to accept that, I can either click that or I can double click right in here. Now we want to have, we're doing our background first. And if I want to copy this, I could press Control A and copy the whole thing, deselecting Control D, or I can hold down Control and Alt. And you'll notice we have two different icons that changed there. One was this one. This is the Move tool, and Control is down. I can move that around. And the other one is the Copy tool, and you'll see it has two little arrow icons on there. When I do that, it's going to copy it, and I'm going to bring it down right here. So I have a whole background, and it copied it down. You'll also notice that over here, it made a new layer. So now we have 2 layers of wood. Gorgeous. Sometimes you'll want to merge things down if you know that you're not going to go back into it. And to merge something down, you can either go over here, select Merge Down, or Control E, and you'll get used to that. Control E puts it back into one layer. And it's often a very good habit to name your layers so you know what layers are there. Double click on the name and just say wood. Very descriptive. So now we're going to take one piece of this wood here, and what I did was I pressed M for the marquee tool, and I make this marquee go over here. I remember in college they called these dancing ants. I hate that so much. And Control C to copy, Control V to paste. Made a new layer. We're going to transform that. We're going to rotate this counterclockwise 90 degrees or clockwise. There's a couple ways of doing it. You can right click while you're in transform mode. You can do right click rotate counterclockwise. You can also go over here and you'll notice it changed this to minus 90 degrees. So it rotated it just nicely. And we have it nicely aligned it up there already for us because we already have it in the proper size. I might want to just squeeze it just a little bit there, and not too much because you don't want to make it really obvious that that it is squished. And that reminds me too, there's probably probably want to have consistency between this one and this one. So I could go into this wood one, and I could actually I could squish that down just a little bit so that they're both kind of the same. And I can move that down there and move it up here like so. If you find that it's not in the right spot. I have some snapping going on here, which is good. You can use the arrow keys to move it around by um, single lines. You can also zoom into this. No, cancel. You can also zoom into it and you can change it. This is my favorite layout, for Photoshop. I have the navigator over here. If I wanted to zoom in on here, I can't use the zoom tool because it's going to want me to accept that. I can zoom in just by going over here, even while I am on the transform tool, and I can zoom out. Now, let's see. Okay, well, let's proceed. So double click on that, accept that. We have our background tool, or our background wood, and our side wood. Let's proceed in making the frame. So while I'm on this layer, and whatever actions you're doing is going to be on the layer selected. So I'm on that layer. I'm going to press Control and Shift. I'm going to move this guy over here, and I have that moved over there. Now I'm going to do that again. I'm going to move it into the middle. I'm going to press Control T for transform, rotate it clockwise, move it up to the top, and accept that. Now I'm seeing we have it 157. If you use this often, it won't go to like 100 or whatever. So keep that in mind if you are editing texture. All right, so we're at 100. I'm going to copy that down here. Now notice when I copied that down, it didn't go all the way down to the bottom. I want to move that so that we're nicely lined up. It looks also like that happened over there as well. You've got to be nitpicky about your textures. I also am noticing that since I copied it, there are certain, like one side has no shadow on the lip, and I might want to just change those around so that there's a little bit of a shadow on the lip. Now, to find out which texture, which layer this is on, I can either go over here, I see that's the right side, or I can try to find it by holding down Control and pressing the right mouse button, and I can see layer wood copy is probably the one I want. I can press Control T, right click, flip horizontal, and there we are. Now we have it with a little bit of shadow over there. We still have, I think, one texture, or one pixel. Yeah, there we are. So we have 2 pixels on the right, 1 pixel, and then 0. So we're good there. And this guy, we're going to make sure we have that one selected. We're going to press Control T. You're going to flip vertically. Got to use your adverbs correctly. And double click. Now we have, we can see there's one line over there, one line over there. We have the right one selected. I'm going to hold down Control, use the right arrow key, bring it down, the bottom arrow key, bring that down. All right. Okay, so now we have our basic frame. It's also very good to save and save often. So I'm going to go over here, classes folder, and I'm going to say new, oh, I already have a new crate. I've done it a couple times. I'm going to call it crate 2. So save your PSD file. Don't just make it and then leave it alone. So that's looking good so far. Now I'm going to take this bottom one. I'm going to bring it up here. I'm going to hit Control T again. Now this one's going to be the diagonal one. So I'm going to go over there and change that to 45, minus 45. Press Enter on the numeric keypad and put it like that. Now, I'm going to move this layer because it's all on top of everything. I'm going to move it underneath the frame layer, and that will make our crate texture. You might think that's great, but we can still go further. Say it's not so. Um, we also have, okay, so now what we want is we want these guys to be cut diagonally. I know there's a term for that in construction, but I don't really know a lot about it. Um, I've done it, not very well, but that doesn't matter. That's a story for another time. Now, if I hold down Shift, you'll notice while I'm doing this, oh, by the way, I pressed L for lasso. I can align something to a horizontal, horizontally. So I can do Shift, it'll hold it horizontally, or I can do vertically. I can also do 45, it'll snap to those generally. So I want to find a good one to start with. You don't have to start right over here. In fact, generally it's kind of good to start outside of it. So I click one, I hold down Shift, I get that nice 45. And notice I'm going outside of the actual space for the texture. This is often good just to make sure that you get all of the pixels. Now I can either go right over to where I started, or I can go over here and double click, and that will select that. Now we want to delete the part of the layer that is active, or the proper layer. We're on the correct one over there. So I press delete, and now I press Control D, and I deselect it. And now we have a nice edge over there, a nice corner. We do have some mirroring, which looks a little weird. It's not too bad. And now we're going to cut this side. So I click over about here with Shift down. I have the nice 45-degree angle. I can lift up Shift and go over here and double click over there, delete that. Now we have that guy. Now we have the bottom ones. Make sure you're on the right one, correct one. So layer 1, copy 3 is what we want, or we could go Control right click, layer 1, copy 3. That's selected. Press L for lasso, and hold down Shift and click about there. Click over there, click, double click, and delete that. Control D. Now that's all set. I'm going to do this side over here. Shift, click, click. I shouldn't say click. I do some Foley effects as well. Okay, so we have our basic crate over here. Looks a little funky, but we're doing it fast. And that is going to be our crate shape. Now let's group these guys together. This is our basic crate texture. To group things, you click the top one, you can click the bottom one. You hold down Shift and click in this blank space, and it will select all of those layers. And then we go over, I think you can click right over here to make group from a layer, or you can go over here, select new group from layers. It'll ask you to give a name, and I'm going to say crate, crate wood. Okay, so we have that. Now we want to make our highlights and shadows. So this is the new layer button. Click that once and twice, and double click over here. We're going to change this to shadows. Double click over here. We're going to change this to highlights. All right, and let's save it. Now shadows are generally set at multiply, and what this means is that you're going to multiply what's in here on top of this, and you can just use black if it's a transparent layer, but multiply is very handy. Notice this is also blue too, so it's currently selected. You can bring down that drop down. You can use the arrow keys and go around. But if you try to use a key command right now, it's not going to let you do it. So annoying. So my little trick for getting out of that is click on channels and go back to layers, and now it is deselected. Now we want to add a little bit of shadow in here and in here. And it's generally, it's like ambient occlusion, which has a form of radiosity, I think, and that just has a little bit of a shadow showing you just some depth. And you'd be amazed at how much that little bit of shadows will actually go a long way to making it seem real. So we're just going to use our lasso tool and eyeball this, clicking over here. And again, use the shift, get a nice straight line. Shift will get that. Shift gets that. We have one over there. Now, another use for shift is adding to the selection. So here we're going to hold down shift, and you'll see a little plus sign in there. That means we're adding to that selection. Oh, our shift is not working the way it had been. So I have to eyeball it. Oh, okay, I lifted it up afterward, and then it made it work the way I wanted it to. Interesting. Double click, oop, escape. Okay, so now we have the areas where we're going to do our shadows. Now we're going to use the brush, and the brush is B, and we have a big brush over here. We have our opacity. Never sure about the difference with flow, but generally I just change the opacity. And our colors are over here. This is the foreground color, this is the background color. You can flip them if you press X, or you can click this one. If you happen to change the color to something else, I just double clicked on that and I brought up another one. You can also default back to black and white if you press D. All right, so you can also change the size of the brush by the bracket keys. Bigger, smaller. We want something that's going to be kind of small and not a lot of opacity. And then we'll just kind of give the edge over here. You can hold down shift here also to get a straight line, or you can just eyeball it. But sometimes it's good to have that exactitude. So we're just going to do just a little bit in there. If I were to click over here with the shift down, it's not going to do it now. Sometimes it'll remember the last point that you had shift down, and you'll have this weird shadow line going over there. So sometimes you have to click outside of it in order to let go of that. Again, just the edge. And we're going to make just a little there. You also notice it's additive. So if I were to go over here, it's not going to do anything deeper or more black. If I go around like that, I have to lift up and then click again, lift up and then click again. And I'm going to undo that. All right, so now we're going to go on this one here, and I don't think shift will do when you're using the brush, a diagonal line, so I have to eyeball that. You could also do feathering on this, but that's a little more complicated than I really want to get at the moment. There's that. Click out there, hold down shift, do this edge, go down a little bit more, get it darker. That might be too much. You don't want a really big, obvious thing there. There. There you go. All right, so we have our basic. There you are. Let's try one more time. There we have our basic shadows. Now we're going to do our highlights. That looks pretty good. Okay, now our highlights, we can do the same thing. You're probably going to want to keep this on. Here's a nifty little trick. This is how you invert. Oh, we're going to click on this guy here. This is how you invert a selection. you press Control, Shift, and I, and that will invert it from one area, and I'll keep flipping it back. You don't want to do Control I because that inverts the actual color. And I think you can find that in Select and Inverse. Control Shift I. And highlights, it's always, I'm going to flip these guys by pressing X. I have that. And press B for the brush. Highlights can be, this is what it looks like if you just do white. And it looks a little strange. It looks like distressed wood, which is not bad. But you can desaturate your colors in another way if you want. And again, it's additive. You can see it gets more and more white. Highlights should generally be, I think, either screen or overlay. Overlay gets a really nice, interesting color right there, and kind of gives some good variation, because if we turn this off, and I'm going to turn off a layer just by clicking this eye, we see what it looks like without the highlighted area. Also, if I press Control H, I can highlight our, or I can hide our marquee tool, and I can see what we have. So we have a lot of similarity in this whole layer, and when we add that, get some variation, it looks really nice. So make it a little bit bigger, give a couple areas some new variation to it, but we'll want the top one being a little bit more highlighted than the other. You'll also notice that because we're masking off the shadow area, we're not getting anything in that shadow area, which is a good thing. You can also do a duplicate highlight layer if you want different kinds of highlights, if you want one that's screen. And I think that's probably pretty good right there. We could actually go down here and create a new shadow layer and make it darker under here. But then again, you never really know if the crate is going to be always facing one direction. So if you have the top part over here highlighted, the bottom part shadows, what happens if physics for the object flips it over? Then you have your highlight on the bottom and your shadow at the top. It's going to look a little silly. Somebody might point and laugh, and we don't like that. So save that and deselect this, and there's our texture. Now, saving it out to a texture file, there are a bunch of different formats that you can save it out as. In general, just for example, we're going to go JPEG. It all depends on what the engine is. We used to use PCX a lot back in the day, and that was because PCX is really good for indexed color, which means like limiting your colors down to a certain number, like 256 colors, or early games had like 8 colors. So we don't have to do that. PNGs are often really good. PNGs are often really good for transparencies, but you can't really control the transparency like you can a TGA. TGAs have their own alpha channel built into the file, and you'll get to know what all these guys are soon enough. But just for example, we're just going to choose a JPEG, call it Crate2, save it, and 9 is good. And there we are for our crate texture, and now we're going to go into Maya in the next video.